The auditorium was packed, every row filled with proud parents, teary grandparents, siblings holding signs. My name was called, last Dr. Linnea Voss, highest honors. Applause erupted, echoing through the high ceilings as I walked across the stage. I held my diploma, tight fingers trembling, not from nerves but from the silence I knew was waiting for me off stage. I turned instinctively, scanning the seats where my family should have been. 2 rows near the front were empty, untouched programs still resting on the chairs. My classmates waved at cameras posed between bouquets. I stood on the side, adjusting my gown, smiling for strangers who offered polite congratulations. That morning, my parents had texted from Manhattan. "We're so proud of you," they wrote, attached to a photo of Seth in a tailored suit cutting a cake that read, "Congratulations, VP Voss." My mother's message followed a minute later. "Try not to feel bad if Seth's news overshadows yours." Timing is everything. I didn't cry. I had stopped doing that years ago. Instead, I took a deep breath and walked past the press wall where graduates snapped photos with their families. A woman from the registrar's office stopped me, hugging me tightly. "We've never had someone finish with your defense score," she whispered. "Your advisor said you made the committee rethink everything." I thanked her. Then I walked alone to the car I had borrowed from a friend, sat behind the wheel, and let the applause I didn't hear fade behind me. There was no ride home, no dinner reservation, no gold-lettered card. But there was something else. There was a strange, steady certainty growing in my chest as I turned the keys and pulled away from the campus for the last time. I used to think love came in the form of attention. So when Seth won his first middle school debate tournament and my parents threw him a surprise dinner, I convinced myself they just hadn't noticed the art competition I'd quietly won the same week. He had a certificate and a photo with the mayor. I had a ribbon folded into the back of my notebook. It wasn't that they didn't love me. They just didn't understand me. Seth wanted what they wanted: status, performance, measurable success. He asked for golf lessons. I asked for more library hours. He spent weekends at tennis camps and mock trial tournaments chauffeured by our father's paralegal. I spent mine painting on plywood scraps in the garage, wiping my hands on old SAT prep books. By high school, the difference wasn't subtle anymore. Seth got internships at firms I'd only read about, networking they called it, though it was really just our father calling in favors. I worked after-school shifts at a bookstore, saving every dollar for college applications they said were a waste of time. When I was accepted into a summer ethics program in Vermont, my mother said, "Still chasing fantasy." My father added, "Dreams don't pay the mortgage, Linnea." They signed the permission form reluctantly, then forgot to ask how it went. Later, when I got the scholarship letter from Cambridge, full ride, merit-based international cohort, my mother looked at it, skimmed the letterhead, and said, "So, more school." My father didn't say anything at all. He was too busy checking the LinkedIn update Seth had just posted, accepted into junior leadership rotation at Bryson and Tate. It had 300 likes by dinner. I packed my own suitcase, booked my own flight, said goodbye to no one in particular. At orientation in the UK, I remember watching other students call home, laughing with parents on video chat, sharing their schedules. I had sent a text when I landed. No one replied until the next afternoon. "Don't forget your coat," my mother wrote. "It rains a lot there." I saved the message not because it meant something, but because it was all there was. And I learned then, love doesn't always arrive. Sometimes you just keep moving without it. The dining room hadn't changed. Same oak table, same silver candelabras that only came out for holidays. Same fireplace mantel crowded with Seth's framed milestones, his MBA acceptance, his wedding portrait, even a photo of him shaking hands with the mayor after some housing development ribbon cutting. I never saw a single picture of me in that room. They had invited me out of obligation. That much was clear when my mother seated me on the far end, 2 chairs down from the neighbor's daughter and across from a man I didn't recognize. Seth arrived late naturally and was greeted with applause like he'd just returned from war. He closed the Lakeside deal, my father beamed. Added $12 million in assets to the portfolio. I smiled. I was happy for him. I always had been. But when I tried to share that I'd recently returned from a policy summit in Nairobi, my mother blinked slowly and asked, "Is that near Morocco?" No one responded when I clarified. The conversation had already shifted to Seth's new condo in Arlington. Later, while I was helping clear the dishes, I overheard my father in the den, laughing with 2 of his colleagues. "She's still in that humanitarian stuff, whatever that means. At least Seth makes moves we can quantify." I didn't cry. I folded the napkins, put the leftover stuffing in containers, I loaded the dishwasher like I had after Seth's high school graduation party when our mother had told him, "You're the pride of this family." I'd been standing right beside her. When I finally left, I hugged no one. My ride to the airport was an Uber I called from the sidewalk. I looked back once, just a glance at the windows warm with lights and laughter. Then I turned away. By the time my flight landed in D.C., I had deleted every photo from the night. 2 days later, I submitted my final report on urban displacement patterns during transitional regimes. The lead strategist asked if I wanted to speak on it at a regional conference. I said yes, and I didn't tell anyone back home. Not because they wouldn't care, because I no longer needed them to. The invitation to join the advisory board came in the middle of a rainy Tuesday. I was eating cold leftovers in the break room when my supervisor forwarded the email, CCing me with a note. "They're watching you. Good work." It was a pilot coalition 10 nations, 5 NGOs, and a rotating advisory seat to monitor refugee resettlement programs. My task wasn't glamorous. It meant long nights reading inconsistent policy drafts, comparing legislative loopholes, tracking funding trails. But I loved every second of it. When my first report was cited in a UN session, I didn't even know. A colleague texted me a photo of the screen. My name looked foreign under the Geneva lights printed in Helvetica between 2 delegates arguing over implementation metrics. I stared at the photo for a long time. Then I put my phone down and kept working. At home, the emails kept coming always, in group threads, always themed. Seth just bought a lake house. Seth's wife is expecting. Seth was nominated for the Regional Finance Board. I never replied. They never asked how I was doing, and that silence started to feel less like a wound and more like a wall I was learning to decorate. I rented a small apartment near DuPont Circle. The walls were thin and the heating hissed in winter, but it was mine. I stacked books on the windowsill, filled the fridge with exactly what I liked, set reminders to call the people who actually noticed when I was gone. When the keynote invitation arrived, Global Migration and Equity Forum in Geneva, I read it 3 times before it sank in. They wanted me to speak. Not as someone's assistant, not as a stand-in, as myself. I booked the flight the same day, used my miles to upgrade to business class, and when I packed, I chose a black suit I'd bought with my first full paycheck. Understated clean lines, no label. The morning I left, my mother sent another update. Seth just got invited to a finance gala. Front page coverage. I stared at the subject line for a moment. Then, I archived the thread, zipped my suitcase, and stepped into the rain without an umbrella. The luncheon was held in a private gallery just off 14th Street, all minimalist furniture and catered plates arranged like exhibits. I wasn't supposed to attend. My colleague had dropped out last minute and they asked if I could step in. I nearly declined. Geneva had only been 2 weeks ago and I was still recovering from the high of it. But something told me to go. Miles Granger introduced himself with a firm handshake and a glass of water instead of wine. "You're Voss," he said, scanning my name badge. "You gave the closing keynote in Geneva. The bit about equity not being charity that stuck with me." I thanked him, unsure what else to say. He was older than I expected, sharp-eyed, thoughtful in a way that felt earned. He asked smart questions about policy fatigue, funding gaps, community-led reform. I answered carefully, aware I was being studied. Halfway through the meal, he leaned in and asked almost offhand, "Do you happen to know a man named Seth Voss?" My fork paused. I smiled. "That's my brother." Miles blinked, then chuckled. "Small world." He interviewed at our fund last fall. Bright guy, great credentials. But a little eager. Talks more than he listens. I took a sip of water to steady myself. That sounds about right. He didn't press further, and I didn't offer more. We shifted back to climate financing, but something had shifted in the air around me. Something quiet, but seismic. Not just that he knew Seth, but that he had met us both and remembered me. Afterward, as we walked out beneath a gray sky, Miles handed me his card. "I'll be in touch," he said. "There's a seat opening up on one of our strategy boards. Would love to hear your thoughts." I tucked the card into my coat pocket and thanked him again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table turning the card over in my hand while my phone buzzed beside me. Another family thread Seth featured in Business Today. I didn't open it. I just looked at the name printed in silver ink across the card, Miles Granger, Senior Partner. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the last hiring list I'd reviewed. The folder landed on my desk late on a Thursday, marked Urgent in red ink across the tab. It was the quarterly hiring slate for strategy consultants, one of the last steps before onboarding approvals. I flipped through names, making mental notes until I saw his. Voss Seth. He had applied for a senior advisory role on the international strategy team, the same department I had helped design the metrics for, the same space I'd spent 3 years building from scratch. I didn't react, not out loud. I just set the folder aside and stared out the window for a long minute. His resume was exactly what I expected, polished, confident, packed with keywords. He'd clearly done his research, but under global impact experience, the examples were superficial. Regional sales expansion, internal training modules, nothing substantive. Later that evening, a message popped up from my mother. The subject line was simple, "Help your brother." The body of the email was worse. "He really needs this, sweetie. You know how important this is to your father. Can't you just help for once? You've always been the sensitive one." I closed the tab. No reply, no hesitation. The next morning I reviewed the folder again. Most names were approved with minor comments, but when I got to Seth's, I drew a single line through the margin and typed the rejection note for HR to finalize. Before I sent it, I paused, then added one sentence at the bottom, an addition I knew they'd let stand. Sometimes degrees do matter. I hit send and returned to my notes for the migration policy review. No one responded. Not my mother, not Seth, not the HR team. They processed the rejection like any other. It was done. The silence that followed wasn't hollow this time. It was clean. It filled the room like fresh air. For once, I wasn't shrinking beneath their expectations or trying to dodge their disappointment. I was simply standing exactly where I belonged. 2 weeks later, a new investment file appeared in my inbox. A small acquisition. Nothing flashy. But when I scanned the list of shareholder names, one of them made me sit back in my chair. The company was a shell dressed up with recycled branding and half-finished language about urban revitalization. The acquisition team flagged it for its real estate potential, nothing more. I wouldn't have given it a second glance until I saw the list of personal investors attached to the firm's failed bridge round. There it was, near the top, Gerald Voss. And just below that, Seth Voss listed as strategic lead and advisor. I stared at the document, rereading the line item that showed how much my father had invested. It was nearly everything: his pension withdrawal, a second mortgage, even a liquidation of bonds I remembered him bragging about at my cousin's wedding. There was a note in the margin: acquisition to proceed. No objections filed. They didn't know. They couldn't have. Not yet. I signed the internal authorization with steady hands. No announcement, no message, no nameplate change, just a formal ownership transfer and a standard legal notice scheduled to go out with the rest. 30 days. That's what the letter said. 30 days until existing operations ceased, all assets reassessed, all leases reviewed. It was standard language, impersonal, final. The property tied to the firm's last investment portfolio was a residential unit on Leland Avenue, an old 4-bedroom brownstone they had used as collateral for a community redevelopment loan that never materialized. It had been quietly deeded to my father as temporary holding listed under his name. He had once told me years ago that the house would be Seth's stepping stone, a starter property to flip, build, expand. Something real. I had driven past it once. I remembered the bay window, the ivy curling up the side, the porch light that never quite worked. I'd watched my father standing on the stoop that summer, arms crossed, nodding proudly as Seth paced beside him on a call. Now the deed was mine. I added one line to the notice before signing off. All keys and tenant files must be returned to the new owner's representative by Friday close of business. Then I clicked send, and I waited for them to read the fine print. The invitation hadn't even been addressed to me directly. I'd been copied CC'd on a mass message from my mother with a digital card attached. Join us to celebrate Aiden's 3rd birthday, backyard lunch, catered brunch, family photos at 2. Beneath the pastel balloons and polite script was a note. We'd love to see you, Linnea, but don't feel obligated. It's mostly family. Mostly family. As if I hadn't been born from her body. As if I hadn't once vacuumed confetti off that same patio after Seth's college graduation while she poured champagne for his friends and called him the pride of our bloodline. I didn't reply, but I didn't ignore it either. That morning, as guests began to arrive with gifts and sunglasses, a black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out in a tailored suit, handed the envelope to my father, and left without a word. They opened it on the porch, surrounded by streamers and catered trays. Inside was a single-page mortgage transfer, formal and stamped. Effective immediately, the property at 92 Leland Avenue had been transferred to the ownership of Dr. Linnea Voss. Stapled beneath it was an eviction notice. At the bottom in my handwriting, a short RSVP. Regretfully, I cannot attend the party. I will, however, be arriving next Friday to inspect the property. Please ensure the keys are on the counter. I never heard the silence that followed, but I felt it. My phone rang 7 times that night, 6 voicemails from my mother, a string of texts from my father. Even Seth called his name lighting up on my screen like a ghost I'd already buried. I let it ring, not out of cruelty, but because this wasn't about cruelty anymore. This was about peace, the kind they never gave me, the kind that doesn't require permission or performance, the kind that simply arrives and stays, quiet, deliberate, immovable. The following week, I arrived at the house with a lockbox and a clipboard. A property manager met me at the gate. The porch light was off. No one had left a note, but the keys were there just as I'd asked. The house was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just outgrown the version of myself that once felt so small inside it. I walked through each room slowly. The living room still smelled faintly of pine cleaner. The same beige sectional sat under the bay window. The dining chairs had new cushions, but the frame was still chipped from when Seth kicked one over during a birthday tantrum. No one had ever fixed it. They just rearranged things to hide the flaw. The walls were covered in frames. Seth at prom, Seth at college Seth with his newborn son. I searched the hallway, then the study. Not a single photo of me. But I didn't feel erased anymore. I stopped in the den where the fireplace stood as the centerpiece. The same mantel where my mother once promised to hang real accomplishments. She had meant awards with job titles, not research fellowships, not thesis medals. From my bag, I pulled the frame I'd had made months ago. A copy of my doctorate diploma, embossed and sealed. Below it, a brass plaque read, "Most likely to fail." I hung it above the mantel without ceremony. There was no applause, no phone held up to take a picture. Just me standing in the house they said I'd never deserve. I took one last walk through the kitchen, checked the back door, then returned to the front. The keys were still on the counter where they had left them. I slid them into my coat pocket, walked outside, and turned the lock behind me, not out of spite, but because the girl who once begged for a seat at the table now owned the table, the chairs, and the roof above it. I moved back to Boston in early spring. The air was still sharp, but the light was changing. I found an apartment on a quiet street near the river, nothing extravagant but full of windows. I furnished it slowly. No rush, no one to impress. The emails started coming again, this time softer. "We're proud of you. Saw your article in the Times, great work. Come by sometime if you're in town." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. They weren't angry anymore, just polite. Like I had become a distant professional contact they couldn't afford to lose. I spent my mornings writing, my afternoons consulting, and my evenings preparing a new keynote for the International Forum on Civic Inheritance. Title ownership and legacy, rewriting the inheritance. I wrote it not for them, but for the ones like me. The ones who built homes from cold silence, who grew roots in places no one watered, who turned absence into momentum. I thought of the girl I used to be, hunched over scholarship essays while Seth's parties roared downstairs. I thought of the night I stood alone at graduation, and the morning I hung my degree in a house I didn't even want anymore. They said I was too soft for the real world, but the world turned in my hands because I never hardened. I didn't carve my name into anything, I didn't raise my voice. I just stood still until they had no choice but to recognize what wouldn't bend.